Hi, and welcome back to the DIY SV Polaris channel. On this episode, we're going to be talking about alternators and external alternator regulators, specifically for diesel engines. One of the first considerations you have to make if you're upgrading your alternator is the compartment that it's in. Is it going to be exposed to gasoline vapors? If so, you're kind of stuck with marine grade ignition protected alternators. But if not, then there is a wide range of automotive high output alternators that can cost a quarter of the price of marine alternators. And they can give you a lot of output for really small money. Alternators are one of the simplest electromechanical devices that you're going to deal with on an engine, and you shouldn't be intimidated by what's going on inside, even if you don't understand how all the pixies are whirling around inside of there. There are about 8 basic components inside, and if you have a rough outline of what they do, you can modify an internally regulated alternator for external regulation. Fairly simple, and there's tons of videos on each individual case alternator on YouTube that we're going to be talking about to modify them, rebuild them, disassemble them, even though you're not going to have to go that far. We're mainly talking about taking high output automotive alternators and converting them for external regulation. If you're still working with a stock alternator on your main engine, you're probably dealing with an internally regulated alternator. And for small boats that have one start battery and just a few wet cells for the house bank, that can be a reasonable thing to work with. But once you move beyond that, it becomes less than ideal. Most boats have moved on to AGM and lithium, and charging these batteries to a fixed voltage as an internally regulated alternator does, it becomes an issue, and it can cause excessive wear on your batteries, an excessively high temperature alternator, and you can run a DC-DC regulator to charge your AGM or lithium house bank, but once you start to move more current and you get above 50, 60 amps of charging, then it starts to make less sense to deal with the layout of the stock alternator, the expensive DC-DC chargers as the amperage moves up, and it makes more sense to move the output of the alternator over to the house bank directly, and then possibly charge your start battery through a duo charge or through a small DC-DC regulator. Let's go over the basic components of an alternator just to get you familiar and demonstrate how simple these devices really are. Up front we have the drive pulley, after that the front case, and behind that the rotor. Surrounding the rotor is the stator, and then we have the back half of the case that holds the rectifier and brush assembly. Some alternators will have a few additional components, but this is the majority of what you're going to see. And it's not necessary to understand the whole idea of what's going on, but knowing what the components do will make you comfortable in making modifications if necessary. Essentially, the front pulley on the alternator spins what's called the rotor inside the alternator, which is just a giant electromagnet that sits inside of a set of windings called the stator. As the rotor is spinning, the regulator at the rear of the alternator varies the power going to the rotor, and as it does, it increases and decreases the magnetic field to the rotor. And that is what's picked up by the windings in the stator as AC current, and then that current is passed down to the rectifier and converts it to DC, and then that's sent out to the positive terminal on the back side of the alternator. As you can see, there really aren't that many components involved, and most of them are fairly simple to work on. The limitations of the internally regulated alternator on a boat are many. Firstly, the internal regulator that controls the power to that rotor to control the amount of output it's delivering, it doesn't have much information to work with. And the vast majority of internally regulated alternators are simply looking at the voltage at the output terminal to determine how to drive the alternator. It's not taking into account the voltage drop that's happening between the output terminal of the alternator and the battery bank, which can be as much as half a volt, if not higher in some scenarios. And because it doesn't know that, you're going to run into a situation where you start the alternator, say you're at a 50% state of charge, and you've got an internally regulated alternator, and it's rated at 90 amps or something like that. You got the high output, alternator for your factory Yanmar or whatnot, and then you start it up and you see 65 amps when you raise it up to 2000 RPMs, but within 15 minutes the things drop down to 35, 40 amps or less. And the reason for that is that the voltage is referenced at the terminal of the alternator, not at the battery. And then compounding that is the fact that as the alternator heats up, it becomes less efficient and the voltage drops down. So you kind of have two things working against you. Now, if you're having this effect and you're not interested in actually converting your existing alternator to external regulation, but you're trying to squeeze out some extra amperage out of your 70, 80, 90 amp Balmar, whatever alternator or stock alternator that you have, the easiest thing that you can do is take the battery positive off the back of the alternator and run the heaviest gauge wire that you can from the back of the alternator to its destination. And that could be at the back of your start switch or straight to your house bank. And because increasing that wire size diameter is going to reduce the voltage drop, what the alternator and its internal regulator is seeing is going to more closely match what's actually happening at the battery. So in many cases that just means 10 foot of 2-aught wire to go from the house bank to your alternator, and that's going to reduce that voltage drop. So the alternator output voltage is going to more closely match the battery voltage. But as you start to move more current, you really need to start compensating for these voltage drops throughout the system. And that's where either an alternator, the few alternators that have internal regulation, that have an external battery sense wire that you can run back to the terminal so the voltage regulator is sensing what's actually happening at the battery, makes sense, or just move on to an external regulator, because converting your existing alternator, if it's decent or worth the trouble, to external regulation changes the whole game. Also, charging to a fixed voltage is less than ideal for AGM batteries and even less ideal for lithium batteries. And in my opinion, there are a lot of AGM batteries that prematurely fail because of long motor passages where they were overcharged even though they were sitting at 14.4 volts. Because you have a fixed internal regulator, it never drops down to a float voltage, so it just sits there and overcharges it. You do that several times throughout the year, and all of a sudden you've got batteries that should have lasted you 6-7 years, and 2 years later your AGMs are, the capacity's dwindled down to half. Furthermore, most internally regulated alternators don't monitor the temperature of the alternator under heavy loads. So if you have a lot of AGMs, or even 3 or 4 AGMs, the internal resistance, if your battery cabling is sized really well, can cause the alternator to run really hot. And if you've got just a few drop-in lithiums, that internal resistance is even lower and can cause the alternator to run hot as well. And having that external regulator and its ability for you to go in and derate the alternator until it has a stable voltage, and also having a backup with a temperature sensor that will derate the alternator if it does ever exceed that for whatever reason, can be really important. And because of that, in my opinion, if you have any significant house bank at all, external regulation is the only way to go, and it's probably not as expensive as you think. For one thing, any alternator can be converted to external regulation, and you don't necessarily need to buy a new alternator. You simply have to open the alternator up and gain access to the wire that's controlling the field from its internal regulator, snip it, attach a wire to it, and run it outside the regulator, outside the alternator, so you can attach your external regulator to it. But usually if you're dealing with a stock alternator, unless it's a reasonably high output, high quality alternator, aftermarket automotive alternators are so inexpensive that it usually makes sense just to buy a new one off the shelf and convert it to external regulation. For example, there are several alternators available with saddle mounts that will fit Yanmar 2, 3, and 4 cylinder engines for around $190. That's considered a 220 amp alternator that will give you 120 amps continuous. And it just takes about a 30-minute job to convert those alternators to external regulation. And you'll gain a lot of knowledge along the way. And if you'd like to step up to the next level, you can find what's called a hairpin stator style alternator with much higher outputs. They're very common in modern cars, so there's a range of them that are available in different saddle mounts and whatnot, and different case sizes to figure out, to fit within your needs. You can find these types of alternators are rated around 130 amps, and they'll deliver about 220 amps continuous if they're hooked up correctly for around $350, which is, a really small amount of money for what you would normally pay to get that kind of power in a marine environment. And of course, there's also the option of buying an actual marine rated high output alternator that has factory field terminals right on the back of it for you to hook up to. But you're probably going to get sticker shock if you start easing up against like the 200 to 300 amp alternator sizes. They're proud of them, and 200 amp alternators, and that can be $1,200. 300 amp alternators can be $2,000 plus for something that you could get a hold of with a small modification, in the $350 range for an automotive alternator. Another consideration is if you purchase your alternator from a small alternator manufacturer, they may be willing to provide you with a field terminal and a tachometer terminal at the back of the alternator for a small extra charge. So now on to external regulators. The base model regulator that I think you should start on the low end is a Balmar ARS5. You can commonly find these regulators online for $175 to $300 at the high end. And they're a great starting point. They have a few weaknesses, but what do you get with the ability of these Balmar external regulators? Well, you have full programmability over the desired stages in each of the 3 charging stages. It's not a fixed voltage charger like your internal regulator is. It's got a bulk, an absorption, and a float voltage that you can program based off the size of your bank. And this allows you to much more accurately charge your batteries because you have those stages and you have that programmability. And furthermore, if you're using lithium, you need to be able to choose a very low float voltage because you want to terminate the charge once you've achieved, a certain voltage or preferably state of charge if you have a higher end regulator. And secondly, you have a voltage reference wire on that regulator that you're going to run back to your house bank terminal, so the regulator is actually seeing battery terminal voltage, not just the terminal voltage at the back of the regulator, which is going to allow you to drive the field a lot more aggressively and get more power out of the alternator. And most importantly, you can add a temperature sensor to the back of the case of the alternator to plug into the regulator, so even after you program the settings and derate your alternator so your temperatures are all in check and you use a thermal temperature gauge to make sure everything is pretty steady, you always have as a backup the temperature sensor. Basically, once you approach whatever you program the regulator for, 200, 240 degrees, whatnot, it'll reduce the field current to 50% until the temperature of the alternator comes into control, and then it'll start driving again. I mean, this is really a must for large AGM banks or lithium batteries. There's really not a whole lot of way around having that programmability and have everything work properly with properly sized cabling. Another fantastic feature of this external regulator is that you can choose to run the alternator at different levels. So even the base model ARS5 Balmar regulator has the ability to turn on small alternator mode via a toggle switch. You can basically derate the alternator by 50%. And the reason that that's so important is you're putting a high output alternator on possibly your 2 or 3 cylinder motor, and while you're motoring, you're going to be motoring for a long time. There's no reason to run everything up at full drive when by the time you got there everything was going to be charged up anyway. So you can just flip a toggle switch that goes to the temperature sensor connection, and it'll derate it by 50% as if it was running hot. By the temperature sensor indicating that it was running hot, it derates it. So you just leave the switch in one position while you're out motoring because you don't want to lose a lot of power because it's a small engine, big alternator. You don't want to sacrifice 15 horsepower of the engine and not be able to power through. So you just leave it in that mode whenever you're motoring. But when you're at anchorage, you want the opposite thing to happen. You don't want to run your primary diesel engine under low loads and just charge it with the stock alternator. I'm sure there's plenty of you out there who have tried to do this and you've wound up with completely coked up exhaust elbows, wet stacking that's built up sludge throughout the system, because you need at least to the bare minimum a 30% load on the engine when it's sitting there running. If not, it's just going to build up sludge throughout the engine. So when you're at anchor, crank the thing up, let it push, 120, 250 amps, and then when you motor, flip the switch down and let it run at whatever you set it to that's reasonable for you. And here's an example of one of these small frame CS130 alternators I've installed on a 3GM Yanmar. And this is with the switch in the normal position. You'll see the amperage will come up to around 130 amps gradually. This setup is just a CS130 quote 220 amp alternator that I have derated to 120 amps roughly continuous, and a Balmar ARS5, and you'll see it climbs up to roughly 130 amps ish. And then you have the option, this is a 3-position switch, so we have the option to run it in the up position at full drive, and the down position is going to be the 50% drive. So this is what you would typically use when you're out motoring. You can see now it's only outputting 65 amps. And we're going to switch it back up into full drive mode again. You'll see that we're going to get back up quickly to 120, 130 amps. And then you have another option of having a center position where you completely disable the output of the alternator if you just don't need it for any reason. You can see we're outputting nothing. There's just a few amps coming from the solar. And here's an example of a fully integrated system that I did a few years ago. This has got a large lithium iron phosphate pack being managed by an REC BMS that feeds that data down to the GX device that you can see has the charge voltage limit, the charge current limit, and the discharge current limit. And those are the parameters that are being communicated to all the devices on the network. The onboard charger, the alternator controllers, which are Wakespeed 500 in this instance, and the solar charge controllers. So everything is in communication. They all have failure modes where they'll revert to a lower voltage charge in case you lose CAN bus communication. But you can see here REC BMS and the Winston pack and a couple multi-pluses and whatnot down there. This customer chose to go with pretty small alternators. He already has a generator that delivers 240 amps of charging through his multi-pluses, so he just wanted to be able to match that same 240 amps whenever he is motoring. So we use Wakespeed 500 regulators and a couple of these CS130 220 amp alternators that are derated to 120 amps each, with 10 rib serpentine belt conversion kits in case, to future proof the system in case he wants to go with larger alternators and ditch that generator altogether in the future. And you can see the Wakespeed and the shunt with the shunt option in that cabinet, and basically the same thing on the other side of the boat. This was my first instance of using these Wakespeed 500 regulators a few years ago, and I just have to say I've been thrilled with them. There's a little bit of a learning curve in setting them up, but the flexibility just can't be beat. There's nothing you can't ask that thing to do that it won't do. There are higher models of Balmar regulators that have additional features such as temperature sensor, failure modes, abilities to control multiple alternators and give you direct access to the data of the alternator with a little cockpit mounted gauge. But in my opinion, if you need more features than you can get with an ARS5 or maybe an MC614, the next logical step is to step up to a Wakespeed 500 regulator. These regulators are incredibly flexible and you can do just about anything you could imagine. They're programmable via an app on your phone, and you can get really specific on what you want the alternator to do. You can hook up a wire to it so it can sense the speed of the alternator, and you can, because the alternator is more and less efficient at different speeds, you can tell it, how you want to drive the field based off of, what RPM it's spinning. You also have the option to put a shunt in line, so you can actually tell it specifically how much current you would like it to deliver at certain speeds. And Even more importantly, it has the ability to output all this data on NMEA 2000. And if you have a Victron system, they're directly compatible with a VE CAN bus. So if you you are seeking a higher level of integration with lithium batteries, and you've got other Victron components in the mix, you've got some sort of GX device, and you've got a BMS that's actually communicating with that. That BMS, if it's compatible with the Victron system, it's going to tell every device that's on that network exactly what it wants to do with that lithium battery. It's not going to tell you, oh, I'm at X voltage, please don't charge past this. It's going to be looking at every device on the network and the sum of the current and voltage drives that's coming in, and it's going to say, I'm willing to accept this amount of current from all these devices together, and it will communicate with all of them to keep it in a reasonable mode. And once you reach what the BMS considers to be a full charge, it'll derate and everything will just gradually throttle down. There's no on-off, there's no trickling, there's no coming in and out of modes. The BMS just commands what everything on the network desires. They also have the ability to control multiple alternators and coordinate back and forth with what you want to do when both are on, and limit your max current for both devices. It's just pretty much endless with the flexibility of this device of what you can do. Now, it does cost roughly twice the price of your average, MC614 or so Balmar regulator, but in this case, you really get what you pay for. And if you're pushing, if you're moving towards something that you want to future-proof, where you're going to end up running lithium in the future, because, we're kind of all headed there. It doesn't financially really even make sense to put in a house bank with AGM anymore, because the lithium prices are so close, and you're talking about 5+ more times the cycle life. So you do have to go back and address these other issues. If you have a stock alternator that's internally regulated, you've got an onboard charger that just charges to a fixed voltage, you do have to address all those things. But once they're addressed, the actual cost of the batteries and what you get out of them, your return on investment is way higher with lithium batteries, and it's just making less and less sense every day to build a large-scale AGM battery bank. If you got a smaller boat and you just got 3 AGMs in there, and that's enough to get you by, and you're happy with it, and you can squeeze 6-7 years out of that, that may be fine for you. But we're all getting power hungry. We've all started to see what the potential of making big power is, and how cheap large solar cells and large solar charge controllers and drop-in lithiums are. And everybody's trying to take advantage of that, and how could you how could you not want to be able to run 3 times the amount of things on your boat that you ever thought was possible 5 years ago? It's awfully tempting. So another consideration with stepping up the amperage that you're going to be delivering with your alternator is the belt drive system. And if you are working with a stock system that still has a single V-belt drive, I would consider a 90 amp alternator to be on the upper limit of what you would want to have on a single V-belt. Even at 90 amps continuous, you're going to get a lot of belt dusting, and you're going to have to replace that belt at the minimum every year. If you're going to go above 80-90 amps, you really need to start out with a 6-rib serpentine belt conversion kit, and they've come down significantly in price. Some are as low as $600, for the full pulley kit to convert over to a serpentine belt kit, to a 6-rib serpentine belt kit, and that'll take you up to about 250 amps or something like that, and if you want to go beyond that, you're going into 8 and 10 rib serpentine belt conversion kits to get up to 300 amps plus. So I think that's it for now. I'll put some links in the description to some devices, alternators and charge controllers and whatnot that I've used throughout the years that have worked well for me, and we'll move on to the next phase and come back around at the end, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense of some of the things that were more obscure as I was working through these systems, and how it all falls together in the end. And thank you for watching.